The clouds are fake. Yo, what's going on? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report is coming from Federico off ETHEREUM. When this happened, 2017, the drugs used were 4-HOMET and Nutmeg. The dose, 8 milligrams of 4-HOMET and an eyeball dose of Nutmeg, guessed around 50 milligrams. The route of administration was orally through a vanilla drink. Gender, male. Weight, 64 kilograms. Age, 21. Prior experience. This is his third time tripping on 4-HOMET. He tripped on acid 13 times at various doses, ranging from 50 to 300 micrograms, and a 1p LSD trip at 200 micrograms. And where this happened? A variety of locations, starting at his house, outside of his house at a lake, later with his friends on a drive, later then at Meyer, and so on and so forth. So this is a pretty solid 4-HOMET experience. The Nutmeg, I do think, added some subtle effects to it, but it's predominantly 4-HOMET. So it's a pretty interesting trip, kind of straightforward, but a good trip nonetheless. So without further ado, let's dive right into it. Having forgotten to take my risperidone the 2 previous nights, I realized I was in a good situation to trip, so I decided to see what would happen if I combined Nutmeg and color, 4-HOMET. This was my third time tripping on color, 8 to 16 milligrams, and I've tripped on acid and acid with serotonin precursors 13 times, 50 to 300 micrograms, and 1p LSD once. As is good practice when combining drugs, I thought I'd take a lower dose than usual of both, and so I decided to take a less than a CNS active dose of Nutmeg, 64 milligrams for me. So I went downstairs, I bought a dose of Nutmeg, and it was actually way more than I thought, so I had to transfer some back into my little spice jar. Once I had removed enough to get it down to about 50 milligrams, I decided to call it good, so I downed it with some milk around 11:30. 1 hour 40 minutes before the start of my trip. I put some more milk in my water bottle and added a generous amount of synthetic vanilla to mask the taste of the color later. About a half hour later, my dad stopped by and asked me if I wanted to come back to his house after he finished shopping with my grandma. I told him sure, since my color solution was in a mini fridge in his basement, and I wanted to see him and grandma. I was in a great mood that day, possibly somewhat due to the lack of risperidone. I was feeling very optimistic that this would be a great trip, and was looking forward to spending time with my dad and grandma. About 45 minutes later, my dad and grandma showed up again. I packed up my PS4, grabbed my coat and gloves, and squeezed into the back seat. We stopped by Taco Bell. This was the first food I had all day, since I'd forgotten breakfast. When we arrived, I went down to the basement after helping my grandma inside. I opened the mini fridge, then the safe inside, and got a 4 milliliter vial of 16 milligrams per milliliter 4-HOMET solution in 80% ethanol. I used a dropper to measure half a milliliter and added it to my super vanilla-y milk. I put everything back and went upstairs, sipping my milk. I ate another wedge of quesadilla and noted that it tasted awful now, although the milk just tasted like vanilla. At about 1:10, the start of my trip, I finished my milk and finished helping putting the groceries away. I connected my PS4 and started to play Horizon Zero Dawn. Around 1:30, 20 minutes in, I started to notice sensations of warmth in my back, feet, and legs. I felt that it was a little easier to laugh at things as well, such as my grandma bad-mouthing my uncle. About 10 minutes later, 30 minutes in, I found the temperature sensations really uncomfortable and got up to go to the bathroom. At this point, there were no visuals, but I was noticing more detail than usual in the game. When I got back to the living room, I ended up telling my dad that I'd taken some color and Nutmeg, and he was worried that I might overdose because I was taking a combination. I reassured him that I took lower than usual doses of both, and thought that the worst that would come of the combination was an extended trip. He asked if he could play some GTA San Andreas and told me to listen to some music or something. I said sure after I saved. I got to a campfire, saved, and relinquished the controller. I listened to half the Chan demo, then told my dad I wanted to go down to the river. When I got outside, 40 minutes in, I noticed enhanced hearing as I could hear the wind easily even though my earbuds were still in. Still not much in the way of visuals, but the come-up rush was definitely happening. I felt fantastic. I started walking down towards the river, but then noticed a car, so I turned around and ran back up to the backyard. Probably would have been less suspicious to just duck into the woods, but I didn't think of it at the time, and I didn't think they'd seen me. I waited until the car drove past, then walked back down to the river. As I was walking down, the Tron demo ended, 45 minutes in, and the next album on my phone, Sethu A's Set Course for Andromeda, started playing. At this time, I began to notice spatial distortion. My perception of time got really weird about then too. As I was walking around, I noticed that one stretch of dirt looked extremely wide, while the rest of the dirt loop that was farther away looked very narrow. I was noticing incredible detail in the pebbles and the dirt. There were 2 trees that I stopped to look at, one very tall one and one willow-like one. After about 10 minutes, 55 minutes in, I went back to the house for a couple of minutes to tell my dad I was gonna walk around and look at things down by the river for a while longer. After reassuring him that I'd come back if I got cold, I went back down. I stopped to look at a very tall tree again. I kept walking around the loop and stopped at the willow. I just watched it sway in the breeze while the music played. I just walked around looking at different things, including a splat of what I think was bird shit. Glad no one saw me puzzling over that, and that this is anonymous. At one point, I really started to notice the visuals when I was looking at a muddy puddle. The puddle was swimming and breathing. I watched it for a bit, not really sure of times during the peak. I kept walking around, finding a really interesting Lynchian pattern on a concrete parking spot meter. A few times when I heard strange noises, I took my earbuds out, but deciding they weren't concerns. Riding one off to geese and another to someone riding a quad somewhere nearby. I was thinking about what great experiences trips are, and how sad it was that my government wants to penalize psychedelic producers and users. At some point, I decided it would be interesting to purposefully walk around the dirt loop while looking at stuff. I started walking the loop. Time slowed way the fuck down. About a third of the way through the loop, I began reaffirming myself that I was a good person, and that I should love and accept myself as I am. After what seemed like 10 minutes, but was probably only a minute, I got back to where I had started walking. I was very disoriented for a second, as I wondered if I had actually only walked the loop once, or if I had done it multiple times and forgot. I was unable to shake the uneasy idea that maybe I had walked around the loop a bunch of times. I decided to walk around the loop again, and I was slightly anxious while doing so, entertaining thoughts about what a weird existence it would be to walk around this loop forever from now on. I briefly wondered if that was going to be my life for the rest of eternity, then laughed the idea off as I remembered many recent events and upcoming plans, as well as the existence of a larger world and my dad and grandma back up at the house. I stopped after what I think the second loop and just looked around. I noticed some really cool geometric overlays on top of everything. Then at some point, I looked up at the clouds. They blew me away. It was like the sky was this massive canvas and tons of intricate patterns were embedded in and moving around the clouds. The rest of the world shrunk after a bit of looking, and it was like the sky took up more than 180 degrees. The most prominent visuals were hexagonal black things, kind of similar to the blackness you get from a drop in blood pressure when standing up. Those were forming and breaking apart by moving blobs of black stuff. I thought about how a friend and I had thought about how the clouds looked fake when we first tried color. I thought about the alien spacecraft and Chicken Little with their pieces of the sky. I wondered if our universe was just some science experiment lying on the higher dimensional equivalent of some transcendent being's desk. I noted that I wasn't getting as much of the red and green hues as my other 2 color trips. After some period of time staring at the clouds, I noticed that my face was kind of cold, so I decided to go back up to the house. I checked my phone and it was around 2:35, an hour 25 minutes in. When I got back up to the front yard, my dad came outside and asked me if I wanted to go for a ride. I said sure. We drove around for about a half hour and saw a deer with one antler broken off. We talked about all kinds of stuff, touching on what tripping is like at one point. He said he was too scared to try it, as he was worried he might trip and never come back to reality. He told me to never take any drugs that would do that to me. It was a sobering conversation, but I was still easy to laughter, and brined up when we saw one of my friends pulling out of his driveway. We rolled down our windows and talked for a few minutes. He looked stoned as fuck. Probably had no clue I was tripping. By the time we got back to the house, an hour 55 minutes in, open-eye visuals had mostly died down, but closed-eye visuals were still there, but kind of hazy and undefined. They'd been fuzzy throughout the trip, so I mostly had kept my eyes open. My dad played GTA for about 10 minutes, then I decided to try one of the Cinnabon Delights, 2 hours 5 minutes in. I was still tripping. I could feel the sugar crystals dissolving in my mouth as a sparkling feeling. It was fantastic. I had another, then went back into the living room. This surprised me somewhat because I usually can't eat while tripping, although I was able to eat a little during my 1P LSD trip and my second color trip. I played Horizon Zero Dawn for the next 45 minutes. Then my grandma came in and started talking to me, 2 hours 50 minutes in. I felt pretty sober at this point, although laughter still came easily. After talking to my grandma for an hour, I played Horizon Zero Dawn for another hour, then packed up my PS4 and had my dad drive me back home to drop it off. I went to a couple friends' dorm room to hang out. We went to Meyer around 7:30, 6 hours 20 minutes in, and I was still in a really good mood, possibly still feeling a little more prone to laughter. At about 10, 8 hours 50 minutes in, one of my friends gave me a hug and noted that I felt really hot. I didn't have a thermometer with me then. I took my temperature at about 3 a.m. as I wrote this, and was 97.6 degrees Fahrenheit, a bit low for me. I feel completely sober at this point, 13 hours 50 minutes in. I don't think being up this late was necessarily due to the color/nutmeg combination, as I have insomnia that usually keeps me awake without risperidone. Overall, the trip was quite a bit more intense than 1 tab of acid. 100 micrograms are 8 milligrams of color. The peaks seemed to last longer and have more intense time dilation than the one I experienced on 16 milligrams of color alone. It was almost as intense as 2 tabs of acid, 200 UGs, but I did not experience ego death. Definitely an enjoyable experience. I might do the combination again in a month or two. Alright, so let's get into a little bit about the substances first, since they are a bit more obscure. Now, we have talked about 4-HOMET in the past, and we will be referencing that report, Derailed Trip by Drugs Addict, which you can find a link in the description below. Now, for most people, probably does sound like some RC just based off the name, but from what we know so far, it does seem to have a fairly green profile as a psychedelic. It was originally synthesized by Alexander Shulgin, a very important pioneer figure when it comes to psychedelics and empathogens, and is often compared to mushrooms since its chemical structure is like that of psilocin. A key difference though in the trip is that it offers more stimulation and tends to be less serious in the headspace and more visually prominent, making it more recreational. Nutmeg, on the other hand, is probably more commonly known. It is used in the kitchen for recipes, but you can also take it to get high. Now, I've heard of all sorts of effects from nutmeg, some delirious effects, sometimes nothing happens, sometimes it gets you stoned as fuck, it's dehydrating sometimes, but I wouldn't say that the dose that Federico took here was that significant to cause some of the main key effects, even though he did note some changes in physical composition later on. Now, with the 50 milligrams in combination, I feel like it may have provided him with some subtle effects here, as he did describe this trip being somewhat different than the average color trip, but obviously it leaves it for 4HOMET to be the dominant factor in this trip here. Now, I do like the comparisons he does bring up from his prior experience with acid, because I do feel like there are similar vibes coming from trips you would find on acid, especially the part where he kept thinking about walking around that loop. But I think this report better highlights how 4HOMET can be better suited as a recreational drug, considering the ease he seemed to have with talking to his dad about tripping, then like helping his grandma and having an hour conversation, going over to his friend's place casually. These type of situations can be huge under certain hallucinogens, though granted he may be fairly comfortable doing these things already while tripping, as some people can be. But the trip here did seem to be pretty thought-provocative, especially when Federico was on his own, though I would guess visually and socially, those were some of the most appealing aspects for him. From personal experience, I have to say Horizon Zero Dawn is one of the most stunning games based off the visuals I've ever played, though I imagine based off the story and the fun combats in that game that also pulled him more into playing. And when we compare this to the first HOMET report on the channel from Drug Addict, this trip seemed to be a lot better planned out, or rather, there was just a much better setting Federico was in. Drugs Addict, on the other hand, he took a way higher dose at 25 milligrams, took it at school first, then he was coming up when he went on the subway and had to take the bus ride home, and then there was some car in his driveway that he didn't know, and there was a lot of things, like a lot of factors that came up that just caused all this distress in him. But even so, he did note some very visually stunning moments. Federico did report some mild anxiety in this report too, and I think there is a similarity here, and that similarity would be a fear of strangers, specifically when you're alone, I think, which makes sense off of most psychedelics. You don't want to necessarily encounter people you don't know, because when you're tripping, you might not have the best time at presenting yourself appropriately, but with other people, you don't necessarily have to be the one to initiate strangers. If they initiate you, you can let your friends or whoever knows your situation handle it for you. Elsewise, if you follow your ground set and setting rules, 4HOMET seems to be like a very solid recreational psychedelic. So I'm going to leave it there. If you want to see more 4HOMET, more Nutmeg, more of anything, let me know in the comments below and I'll get on that. So as always, subscribe, like the video. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.